The sun hung low over the sprawling plains of Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain where Caleb Warwick's ranch stood defiant against time. The land, a patchwork of golden grass and stubborn mesquite, had been in his family for 3 generations, each acre soaked in the sweat and stories of those who came before. Caleb, now in his late 60s, was a man carved from the same unyielding earth, lean, weathered, with eyes like flint and a mind sharper than the barbed wire fencing his property. His days were spent tending to his small herd of cattle, repairing fences, and sipping black coffee on the porch of his modest ranch house, the only home he'd ever known. But beneath the quiet rhythm of his life, a storm was brewing, one that would test the old cowboy's resolve and awaken a fire that had smoldered since his youth. It began with a letter, unassuming in its crisp white envelope, tucked into the rusted mailbox at the end of his dirt driveway. The letter bore the seal of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, a group Caleb had little use for, as his ranch predated their gated communities and manicured lawns by decades. The HOA had crept into existence 10 years prior, a coalition of wealthy newcomers who'd built sprawling estates on the outskirts of town, their influence spreading like wildfire across the county. Caleb had ignored their notices before, petty complaints about his weathered barn or the occasional stray cow, but this letter was different. It spoke of a rezoning initiative, a plan to reclassify his land as part of a new community development zone. The words were polite, bureaucratic, but their meaning was clear. They wanted his land, or at least control over it. Caleb's first instinct was to crumple the letter and toss it into the fire. He fought off coyotes, droughts, and bank foreclosures in his time. A pack of paper-pushing suburbanites didn't scare him. But something in the fine print caught his eye, a reference to a county ordinance he didn't recognize, a legal maneuver that could force compliance or risk forfeiture. His gut churned. This wasn't just another HOA complaint. This was a calculated move, a land grab dressed in legalese. He sat at his kitchen table, the letter spread out before him, and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like a warning signal. Caleb Warwick was no stranger to battles, but this one felt different, like the opening shot in a war he hadn't seen coming. The next morning, he saddled his old mare, Daisy, and rode out to the far edge of his property, where his land met the HOA's pristine development. The contrast was stark, his rolling hills of wild grass buetted up against their manicured hedges and wrought iron gates. He noticed surveyors' stakes driven into the ground, bright orange flags fluttering like vultures circling a carcass. His land, his legacy. The sight ignited a spark in his chest, a mix of rage and resolve. Caleb had spent his life learning the land's secrets, every gully, every spring, every legal boundary etched into county records. If the HOA thought they could outmaneuver him, they were about to learn just how deep his roots ran. He rode back to the ranch and dug through a dusty trunk in the attic, pulling out yellowed maps, deeds, and legal documents his father had taught him to guard like treasure. The papers told a story of resilience. His grandfather staking the claim in 1892, his father fighting off a railroad company in the 1950s, and Caleb himself outwitting a developer in the 1980s who tried to lowball him. Each generation had faced a threat, and each had prevailed. Now it was his turn. He spread the documents across the table, his fingers tracing the boundaries of his 300 acres, memorizing every detail. The HOA's letter mentioned a county board meeting in 2 weeks, where the rezoning would be finalized. Caleb knew he had to act fast, but he also knew better than to charge in blindly. This was a chess game, and he'd need every move planned. Over the next few days, Caleb became a ghost in Willow Creek's records office, poring over dusty ledgers and microfiche. The county clerk, a kindly woman named Martha who'd known Caleb since he was a boy, watched him with curiosity as he cross-referenced property lines and zoning laws. He discovered discrepancies, small at first, like mislabeled parcels, but they pointed to a larger pattern. The HOA had been quietly petitioning to rezone not just his land but several neighboring properties, all under the guise of community improvement. The documents suggested a deal with a development company, one that stood to profit millions by turning rural ranches into luxury estates. Caleb's jaw tightened as he uncovered forged signatures and backdated filings, evidence of a scheme that reeked of greed and corruption. Each night, he returned to his ranch, his mind racing. He sat by the fire, his old dog Rusty at his feet, and pieced together the puzzle. The HOA's president, Evelyn Carver, was the linchpin, a sharp-tongued real estate mogul who'd moved to Willow Creek 5 years ago and quickly taken control of the association. Her name appeared on every suspicious document, her influence woven into every shady deal. Caleb remembered her from a town meeting years back, her designer heels clicking as she lectured farmers about modernizing the county. She was the kind of woman who mistook wealth for wisdom, and Caleb knew her type well. She was dangerous, but she wasn't invincible. As the county board meeting loomed, Caleb began to formulate a plan. He wasn't one for speeches or grand gestures. His strength lay in preparation, in knowing the land and the law better than his enemies. He spent hours drafting notes, cross-referencing statutes, and memorizing the county's zoning codes. He reached out to old friends, ranchers like him, who'd received similar letters but lacked the means or know-how to fight back. Together, they formed a quiet alliance, a coalition of underdogs bound by a shared love for their land. Caleb's resolve hardened with each passing day, his cowboy heart beating with the rhythm of justice. The night before the meeting, Caleb stood on his porch, staring out at the land that had shaped him. The stars were bright, the air thick with the scent of sagebrush. He thought of his father, who'd taught him to fight for what was right, and his grandfather, who'd carved a life from nothing. The HOA might have money and influence, but Caleb had something they couldn't buy: knowledge, grit, and a legacy worth defending. As the wind whispered through the mesquite, he knew the battle was just beginning. Tomorrow he'd walk into that boardroom, not as an old cowboy, but as a warrior armed with the law itself. The morning of the county board meeting dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that made Willow Creek's plains shimmer with possibility. Caleb Warwick rose before the sun, his boots creaking on the worn floorboards of his ranch house as he prepared for battle. He dressed simply: faded jeans, a pressed white shirt, and his father's old Stetson, its brim weathered but proud. In his hands he carried a leather satchel stuffed with documents, each page a weapon in the war he was about to wage. The air outside was sharp, the scent of dew-soaked grass mingling with the faint tang of cattle. Caleb paused on his porch, his gaze sweeping over the land that had defined his life. Today he would defend it, not with a rifle, but with the law he'd spent weeks mastering. The county courthouse sat in the heart of Willow Creek, a squat brick building dwarfed by the ambitions of those who now controlled it. As Caleb pulled his battered pickup into the parking lot, he saw the gleaming SUVs of the HOA board members, their polished chrome a stark contrast to his rusted fenders. The lot was crowded, a sign that the meeting had drawn more than the usual handful of retirees and bureaucrats. Word of the rezoning had spread, and Caleb's quiet outreach to neighboring ranchers had stirred a ripple of defiance. He spotted familiar faces, old-timers like Hank Grayson and Maria Torres, whose families had worked the land as long as his. They nodded to him, their eyes carrying the same steely resolve. This wasn't just Caleb's fight anymore. It was theirs too. Inside, the meeting room buzzed with tension. Rows of folding chairs were filled with ranchers, farmers, and a smattering of HOA residents, their designer clothes marking them as outsiders in this rugged crowd. At the front, the county board sat behind a long table, their faces a mix of boredom and unease. Evelyn Carver, the HOA president, stood near the podium, her tailored blazer and sharp smile radiating authority. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed the room was already hers, her allies, developers and lawyers, flanking her like a royal guard. Caleb took a seat near the back, his satchel on his lap, his presence unnoticed for now. He preferred it that way. Let them underestimate him. It would make their downfall sweeter. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but the air grew heavy when the rezoning proposal was introduced. Evelyn took the podium, her voice smooth as she painted a vision of progress. New homes, shopping centers, a modern Willow Creek that would attract wealth and prestige. She spoke of community benefits, of jobs and tax revenue, glossing over the fact that the plan would swallow up ranches like Caleb's, forcing owners to sell or face crippling regulations. The crowd murmured, some nodding in approval, others shifting uncomfortably. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he listened, his fingers tracing the edge of his satchel. Every word she spoke was a lie wrapped in promise, and he could see the board members, some of whom he suspected were in her pocket, nodding along. When the floor opened for public comment, Caleb waited. Hank went first, his voice rough with emotion as he spoke of his family's century-old orchard, now at risk. Maria followed, her hands trembling as she described the legacy she wanted to leave her children. Each story built the case, but Caleb knew raw emotion wouldn't sway the board. They needed evidence, and he had it. When his turn came, he rose slowly, his boots echoing in the hushed room. Eyes turned to him, some curious, others dismissive. Evelyn's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, her gaze cold and calculating. Caleb didn't smile back. He didn't need to. He approached the podium, his satchel heavy with proof. Without theatrics, he began laying out his case, his voice steady but laced with the grit of a man who'd faced worse than bureaucracy. He presented the forged signatures he'd found, the mislabeled parcels, the backdated filings that violated county law. He cited ordinances with precision, each one a dagger aimed at the heart of the HOA scheme. The room grew silent, the board members shifting in their seats. Evelyn's composure cracked, her fingers tightening on her pen as Caleb revealed a paper trail linking her to the development company, a trail that suggested kickbacks and collusion. He didn't accuse her outright. He didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves, and the crowd's murmurs grew into a low roar of outrage. The board chair, a nervous man named Harold Brooks, called for a recess, his forehead slick with sweat. Caleb returned to his seat, his heart pounding but his face impassive. He'd landed the first blow, but the war was far from over. Evelyn and her allies huddled in a corner, their whispers sharp and urgent. Caleb caught snippets of their conversation, legal terms, threats of lawsuits, but he wasn't worried. He'd spent weeks preparing for this, studying every angle, anticipating their moves. The ranchers around him leaned in, their eyes bright with hope. For the first time, they saw a path to victory, and Caleb was their guide. As the meeting resumed, Evelyn took the podium again, her voice now laced with indignation. She deflected, claiming clerical errors and misinterpretations, promising to review the documents. But the damage was done. The crowd was no longer swayed by her polished promises. They saw the cracks in her facade. The board, sensing the shift, postponed the rezoning vote, citing the need for further investigation. It was a small victory, but Caleb knew it was only the beginning. Evelyn's eyes locked onto his as she stepped down, a silent vow of retaliation. He met her gaze, unflinching, his cowboy soul burning with purpose. That night, Caleb drove home under a sky ablaze with stars. The ranch felt different now, not just a home but a battlefield. He sat at his kitchen table, the satchel open before him, and reviewed his notes. The HOA wouldn't back down easily. Evelyn was too entrenched, her allies too greedy. But Caleb had rattled them, exposed their weaknesses. He thought of the ranchers who'd stood with him today, their courage fueled by his own. The fight was growing, and he was ready to lead it. As he sipped his coffee, the weight of the next move settled on his shoulders. The board's investigation would dig deeper, and Caleb needed to be one step ahead. Tomorrow, he'd start building the next phase of his plan, a strategy that would turn their own rules against them. The days following the county board meeting carried a restless energy, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. Caleb Warwick's ranch, once a haven of quiet routine, now hummed with purpose. His kitchen table had become a war room, strewn with maps, legal books, and handwritten notes that traced the HOA's schemes like a hunter tracking prey. The postponement of the rezoning vote had bought him time, but Caleb knew better than to rest. Evelyn Carver and her allies were wounded, not defeated, and their silence in the days since the meeting was not surrender but strategy. The old cowboy's instincts, honed by years of reading the land and its dangers, told him the next strike was coming, and he intended to be ready. Caleb's mornings began before dawn. his coffee brewing as he pored over county records he'd copied during his visits to the clerk's office. The documents painted a clearer picture now. The HOA's rezoning plan was part of a broader scheme to reclassify rural lands across Willow Creek, funneling them into the hands of a single developer, Crestview Properties. The company's name appeared repeatedly, tied to Evelyn through a web of shell corporations and questionable permits. Caleb's research uncovered payments to county officials, buried in obscure budget reports, and a pattern of rushed approvals that violated state law. Each discovery was a thread in a tapestry of corruption, and Caleb was determined to unravel it completely. He wasn't alone in his fight. The ranchers who'd spoken at the meeting, Hank Grayson, Maria Torres, and others, had become his allies, their resolve strengthened by the cracks Caleb had exposed in the HOA's armor. They met in secret at Caleb's ranch, gathering under the cover of dusk to avoid prying eyes. The group was small but fierce, a coalition of weathered souls who shared Caleb's love for the land and his disdain for those who'd exploit it. They brought their own evidence, letters, surveys, even photographs of trespassing surveyors on their properties. Caleb listened, his mind cataloging every detail, his strategy taking shape like a fence line built post by post. His evenings were spent at the county library, a quiet sanctuary where he could access public records without drawing attention. There, he uncovered a critical piece of the puzzle, a state statute that required public disclosure of any rezoning that impacted private property. The HOA had skirted this law, holding closed-door meetings and burying notices in fine print. Caleb's pulse quickened as he realized this violation could be a fatal blow. He photocopied the statute, along with records of the HOA's secret meetings, and tucked them into his satchel. The law was his weapon, and he wielded it with the precision of a gunslinger. But Evelyn Carver was not idle. Whispers reached Caleb through Martha, the county clerk, who'd overheard heated phone calls in the courthouse. Evelyn was rallying her allies, pulling strings with developers and pressuring board members to dismiss Caleb's evidence as clerical errors. She hired a high-powered attorney from the city, a man known for burying opponents in legal fees and red tape. Caleb felt the noose tightening, but he refused to flinch. He knew the HOA's wealth and influence were formidable, but they relied on intimidation, not intelligence. Caleb's strength lay in his preparation, his knowledge of the land's history and the law's unyielding truth. One afternoon, while checking his fences, Caleb noticed a black SUV parked just beyond his property line, its tinted windows hiding the occupant. He approached, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, but the vehicle sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The incident wasn't random, it was a message. The HOA was watching, probing for weaknesses. Caleb's jaw tightened as he returned to his work, his mind racing. He began varying his routines, locking his gates at night and keeping his old rifle closer than usual. Rusty, his loyal dog, seemed to sense the tension, his ears pricked at every strange sound. The ranch, once a place of peace, now felt like a fortress under siege. Caleb's next move was to rally the community. He organized a meeting at the old Grange Hall, a weathered building that had hosted generations of Willow Creek's farmers and ranchers. Word spread quietly, through handwritten notes and trusted neighbors, to avoid tipping off Evelyn's spies. On the night of the meeting, nearly 50 people filled the hall, ranchers, farmers, even a few HOA residents who'd grown wary of Evelyn's iron grip. Caleb stood at the front, his Stetson in hand, and laid out the evidence with the calm authority of a man who knew his ground. He showed the forged documents, the illegal meetings, the payoffs to county officials. The crowd's anger grew, a low rumble of voices that echoed Caleb's own fire. He didn't need to rouse them with speeches. The truth was enough. The meeting sparked a shift in Willow Creek. Petitions circulated, demanding a full investigation into the HOA's actions. Local reporters, sensing a scandal, began digging, their articles casting a spotlight on Evelyn's schemes. Caleb stayed in the shadows, letting others carry the public fight while he worked on the next phase of his plan. He knew the HOA would counterattack, likely at the next county board meeting, where they'd push to reinstate the rezoning vote. Caleb spent hours refining his strategy, consulting with a retired lawyer friend who confirmed his findings and offered to represent the ranchers pro bono. The lawyer, a grizzled man named Tom, saw in Caleb the same stubborn spirit he'd admired in the old cowboy's father. As the second board meeting approached, Caleb felt the weight of the fight pressing harder. He walked his land at dusk, the horizon glowing red, and thought of the generations who'd fought for this soil. The HOA's greed was a betrayal of everything Willow Creek stood for, and Caleb would not let it stand. He returned to his ranch house, his satchel heavier with new evidence, a whistleblower's testimony from a former HOA treasurer detailing Evelyn's direct involvement in the payoffs. It was the kind of proof that could topple empires, and Caleb intended to use it. The night before the meeting, Caleb sat by his fire, rusty at his feet, and reviewed his plan one last time. The HOA would come prepared, their lawyer armed with arguments to discredit him. But Caleb had the law on his side and something more, a fire in his soul that no amount of money could extinguish. As the flames crackled, he felt the weight of his ancestors' legacy, urging him forward. Tomorrow he would face Evelyn and her allies head-on, not just for his land but for every rancher who'd been pushed to the brink. The battle lines were drawn, and Caleb Warwick was ready to fight. The second county board meeting dawned with a sky bruised purple, clouds heavy with the promise of rain. Caleb Warwick drove into Willow Creek with the weight of his ancestors in his chest, his leather satchel now a talisman of truth. The courthouse loomed ahead, its brick facade a silent witness to the clash about to unfold. The parking lot was a sea of vehicles, pickup trucks of ranchers parked beside the gleaming sedans of HOA elites, a visual reminder of the divide splitting the town. Caleb's boots crunched on the gravel as he stepped out, his Stetson low, his eyes scanning the crowd. The air crackled with anticipation, as if the land itself knew a reckoning was near. Inside, the meeting room was packed, the tension thick enough to choke on. Ranchers and farmers filled the seats, their weathered faces set with determination, while HOA members clustered near the front, their polished appearances unable to mask their unease. Evelyn Carver stood by the podium, her posture rigid, her smile a thin veneer over barely contained fury. Her attorney, a city slicker named Vincent Reed, stood beside her, his briefcase stuffed with legal maneuvers designed to crush dissent. The county board members, led by Harold Brooks, fidgeted behind their table, their authority shaken by the growing scandal. Caleb took his seat near the back, his satchel on his lap, his presence a quiet storm waiting to break. The meeting began with a strained formality, the board's agenda overshadowed by the rezoning issue that had fractured Willow Creek. Evelyn took the podium first, her voice sharp and rehearsed, framing the rezoning as a necessary step for progress. She dismissed the previous meeting's concerns as misunderstandings, her attorney backing her with a slick presentation that blamed clerical errors and overzealous surveyors. The crowd stirred, some swayed by her polish, others unconvinced. Caleb watched, his face impassive, letting her spin her web. He knew her confidence was a facade. The whistleblower's testimony, tucked safely in his satchel, was a grenade waiting to be thrown. When public comment opened, the ranchers spoke first, their voices raw with stories of intimidation. Surveyors trespassing, anonymous threats, offers to buy their land at insultingly low prices. Hank Grayson recounted a late-night call warning him to sell or regret it, while Maria Torres described survey stakes driven into her orchard under cover of darkness. The crowd's anger grew, a low rumble that vibrated through the room. Caleb waited, letting the momentum build, knowing his moment would come. When his name was called, he rose, his boots echoing like gunshots in the hushed room. All eyes turned to him, some with hope, others with dread. Evelyn's gaze was a blade, but Caleb met it without flinching. He approached the podium, his satchel heavy with evidence. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of a man who'd spent weeks forging his case in the fires of research and resolve. He began with the state statute on public disclosure, laying out how the HOA's secret meetings violated the law. He presented the whistleblower's testimony, a sworn affidavit from the former HOA treasurer detailing Evelyn's direct orders to falsify records and funnel payments to Crestview Properties. Gasps rippled through the room as Caleb revealed bank statements showing transfers to county officials, each transaction a nail in the HOA's coffin. He cited legal precedents, his knowledge of county and state law unassailable, each point driving deeper into the heart of the scheme. The board members leaned forward, their faces pale. Harold Brooks mopped his brow, his authority crumbling under the weight of Caleb's evidence. Evelyn's composure shattered. Her hands clenched the edge of her chair, her eyes darting to her attorney, who scrambled to take notes. Caleb didn't relent. He presented maps showing mislabeled parcels, forged signatures on rezoning petitions, and emails linking Evelyn to Crestview's CEO. The room erupted in murmurs, the crowd's outrage now a roar. Caleb's final blow was a call for a state investigation, citing statutes that mandated criminal penalties for public corruption. He stepped back from the podium, his case laid bare, the truth a blazing fire no one could ignore. The board called an immediate recess, the room buzzing as Evelyn and her attorney huddled, their whispers frantic. Caleb returned to his seat, his heart steady despite the chaos. The ranchers around him clapped his shoulder, their eyes alight with gratitude and defiance. The HOA residents in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, some slipping out, unwilling to be associated with Evelyn's sinking ship. When the meeting resumed, Harold Brooks announced that the rezoning vote was indefinitely postponed pending a state audit. The crowd cheered, a wave of triumph washing over the ranchers. Evelyn's face was a mask of rage, her attorney's arguments drowned out by the crowd's fervor. But Caleb knew the fight wasn't over. As the meeting adjourned, he caught Evelyn's glare, a promise of retaliation that sent a chill down his spine. She and her allies would not go quietly. Their wealth and connections ran deep, and they'd strike back with everything they had. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, turning the parking lot to mud. Caleb drove home, the wipers slashing through the downpour, his mind already turning to the next battle. The state audit was a victory, but it was only a delay. Evelyn would regroup, and Caleb needed to be ready. That night he sat by his fire, rusty at his feet, and reviewed his notes. The whistleblower's testimony had been the turning point, but it had also made Caleb a target. He thought of the black SUV, the trespassing surveyors, the whispered threats to his allies. The HOA's desperation would make them dangerous, and Caleb needed to protect not just his land but the ranchers who'd trusted him. He began drafting letters to state officials, leveraging the audit to demand a full investigation into Crestview Properties and its ties to the county board. His lawyer friend, Tom, had promised to file motions to freeze the HOA's rezoning efforts, buying time for the state to act. As the fire crackled, Caleb felt the weight of the fight settling deeper. The land outside his window, now cloaked in rain, was more than soil and grass. It was a legacy, a promise to those who'd come before and those who'd follow. He thought of his father teaching him to read the stars and his grandfather who'd fought off claim jumpers with nothing but a rifle and grit. Caleb's battle was different, fought with paper and law, but the stakes were the same. The HOA had underestimated him, mistaking his age for weakness, his silence for surrender. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The rain that had soaked Willow Creek the night of the second board meeting lingered for days, turning the plains into a sea of mud that mirrored the turmoil in Caleb Warwick's mind. His ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege, its boundaries watched by unseen eyes. The state audit he'd forced into motion was a victory, but it had painted a target on his back. Evelyn Carver and her allies in the HOA and Crestview Properties were not the kind to retreat gracefully. Their silence in the weeks since the meeting was a predator's pause, a coiled snake waiting to strike. Caleb, ever the cowboy, knew the only way to survive was to strike first, and he was ready to wield the law like a branding iron. Each morning, Caleb rose with the dawn, his coffee brewing as he spread his war map across the kitchen table. The satchel, now worn from constant use, held new weapons: letters from state investigators confirming the audit, court filings from his lawyer Tom, and a growing stack of testimonies from ranchers and whistleblowers. The state's probe had uncovered more than Caleb had hoped: bank records showing Crestview's payments to 2 county board members, emails detailing Evelyn's role in orchestrating the rezoning, and a paper trail linking the HOA to a network of shell companies. Each piece was a brick in the wall Caleb was building, a case so airtight it could bury the HOA for good. But the enemy was moving too. Reports trickled in from ranchers, strange vehicles parked near their properties, anonymous letters offering cash for their land, and surveyors bold enough to trespass in broad daylight. Hank Grayson found his water pump sabotaged, costing him days of work, while Maria Torres received a legal notice claiming her orchard violated new zoning codes that didn't exist. Caleb saw Evelyn's hand in every move, her desperation fueling a campaign of intimidation. He doubled down on security, installing locks on his gates and setting Rusty to patrol at night. The old dog's growls echoed Caleb's own resolve, a warning to anyone who dared cross his line. Caleb's strategy shifted to offense. He and Tom filed a class-action lawsuit on behalf of the ranchers, accusing the HOA and Crestview of fraud, extortion, and violation of state land use laws. The lawsuit was a bold move, designed to hit the HOA's finances and expose their corruption to a wider audience. Caleb spent hours with Tom, refining the legal arguments, ensuring every claim was backed by ironclad evidence. The retired lawyer marveled at Caleb's grasp of the law, his mind a steel trap honed by years of reading contracts and deeds. Together, they crafted a case that could bankrupt the HOA's leadership and force Crestview to abandon its plans. The community's momentum grew. The Grange Hall meetings became a weekly ritual, drawing larger crowds as word of the lawsuit spread. Local reporters, now fully invested in the scandal, published exposés that painted Evelyn as the architect of Willow Creek's betrayal. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Save Willow Creek, amplifying the ranchers' fight to a statewide audience. Caleb stayed out of the spotlight, letting others carry the public crusade while he worked in the shadows. He met with state investigators in a dusty diner on the edge of town, handing over copies of his evidence under the table. The investigators, impressed by his thoroughness, hinted at criminal charges looming for Evelyn and her allies. But the HOA struck back with venom. One morning, Caleb found his mailbox stuffed with a cease and desist letter, accusing him of defamation and threatening countersuits that could drain his savings. The letter bore Vincent Reed's signature, Evelyn's high-powered attorney, and was laced with legal jargon meant to intimidate. Caleb read it by the fire, his lips curling into a grim smile. He'd faced worse than threats: blizzards that killed half his herd, banks that tried to foreclose on his land. This was just another storm, and he knew how to weather it. He passed the letter to Tom, who laughed and called it a paper tiger, a desperate ploy to scare Caleb into silence. The real blow came days later. A fire broke out on Hank Grayson's property, destroying a barn and threatening his livestock. The sheriff ruled it arson, but no suspects were named. Caleb drove to Hank's ranch, his heart heavy as he surveyed the charred remains. Hank, his face etched with grief, vowed to keep fighting, but the attack shook the coalition. Caleb gathered the ranchers that night, his voice steady as he urged them to hold fast. He shared the state's latest findings, proof that Crestview had hired private investigators to harass landowners. The news reignited their fire, turning fear into fury. Caleb promised them the lawsuit would hit harder than any flame, and they believed him. As the lawsuit's court date approached, Caleb prepared for the final push. He spent nights reviewing every document, every statute, ensuring no detail was overlooked. He walked his land at dusk, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked sagebrush, and felt the weight of his ancestors' legacy. This wasn't just about his ranch. It was about every family who'd poured their lives into Willow Creek soil. He thought of his father, who taught him to stand tall, and his grandfather, who'd faced down bandits with nothing but courage. Their blood ran in his veins, and he would not let them down. The night before the court hearing, Caleb sat by his fire, Rusty at his feet, and reviewed the lawsuit one last time. The evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, illegal payments, witness testimonies. Tom had warned him that Evelyn's team would fight dirty, likely dragging the case out with delays and countersuits. But Caleb was ready. He'd spent his life learning the land's rhythms, its laws, its secrets. The courtroom was just another frontier, and he knew how to navigate it. As the flames cast shadows on the walls, Caleb felt a surge of certainty. The HOA had underestimated him, mistaking his age for frailty, his quiet for surrender. Tomorrow he would walk into that courtroom and show them the true strength of a cowboy armed with justice. The courthouse in Willow Creek stood like a sentinel under a sky scrubbed clean by the previous night's rain, its brick walls glowing in the morning light. Caleb Warwick arrived early, his pickup truck a lone warrior among the polished vehicles of the HOA's elite. His Stetson sat low, his leather satchel heavy with the evidence that had brought him to this moment. The class-action lawsuit against the HOA and Crestview Properties was the culmination of months of relentless work, a battle fought not with bullets but with the unyielding truth of the law. The air was charged with the weight of a reckoning, and Caleb, the old cowboy, was ready to deliver justice. The courtroom was a cauldron of tension, its wooden benches packed with ranchers, farmers, reporters, and a handful of HOA residents who'd begun to question their loyalty. Evelyn Carver sat at the defendant's table, her face a mask of defiance, her attorney Vincent Reed beside her, his briefcase a fortress of legal countermeasures. The county board members, now under state scrutiny, were absent, their absence a silent admission of guilt. Caleb took his place with Tom, his lawyer, his eyes scanning the room with the calm focus of a man who'd faced down storms and predators. The ranchers behind him sat tall, their faith in him a palpable force. This was not just a trial, it was a war for Willow Creek's soul. The judge, a stern woman named Clara Hensley, called the court to order, her gavel a thunderclap that silenced the murmurs. Tom opened with a methodical presentation, laying out the case with surgical precision. Forged documents, illegal rezoning, payoffs to county officials, and a pattern of intimidation that stretched across years. He called witnesses, Hank Grayson, whose barn had been burned, Maria Torres, whose orchard had been threatened, and the former HOA treasurer, whose testimony detailed Evelyn's direct orders to falsify records. Each story built a wall of evidence, unassailable and damning. Courtroom buzzed, the reporter's pen scratching furiously, capturing every word. Caleb took the stand last, his presence commanding despite his simple attire. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who knew his ground, recounting his discovery of the HOA's scheme, his weeks of research, and the threats that had followed. He presented the state statute violations, the mislabeled parcels, the bank transfers to Crestview Properties. His voice never wavered, each fact a bullet fired with precision. The judge leaned forward, her eyes sharp, while Evelyn's composure cracked, her hands twisting in her lap. Vincent Reed objected repeatedly, but his arguments were swatted down, his polished veneer no match for Caleb's raw truth. The defense's response was a desperate scramble. Reed painted the HOA's actions as well-intentioned mistakes, blaming overworked staff and miscommunications. He attacked Caleb's credibility, calling him an obsessed recluse who'd fabricated a conspiracy to cling to his outdated way of life. But the accusations fell flat. The evidence was too strong, the witnesses too compelling. The ranchers' stories of harassment, arson, threats, trespassing painted a picture of greed and cruelty that no amount of legal spin could erase. Evelyn took the stand, her voice sharp with indignation, but her answers were evasive, her confidence crumbling under Tom's cross-examination. The courtroom felt the shift, the tide turning against her. The trial stretched into the afternoon, the air heavy with anticipation. Judge Hensley called a recess, and Caleb stepped outside, the cool air a balm against the heat of the courtroom. The ranchers gathered around him, their faces alight with hope. Reporters swarmed, but Caleb waved them off, his focus on the land beyond the town where his ranch waited. He thought of his father, who'd taught him to fight for what was right, and his grandfather, who'd carved a legacy from nothing. This was their victory too, a triumph of grit over greed. When the court reconvened, Judge Hensley delivered her ruling with a voice that brooked no argument. The HOA and Crestview properties were found liable for fraud, extortion, and violation of state land use laws. The rezoning was struck down, the affected properties restored to their original designations. Evelyn and 2 county board members faced criminal referrals for corruption, their assets frozen pending further investigation. The courtroom erupted, ranchers cheering, reporters scrambling to file their stories. Evelyn's face was ashen, her empire in ruins, while Vincent Reed packed his briefcase in defeat. Caleb sat quietly, his heart steady, the weight of his satchel finally light. The aftermath was swift and merciless. The state's investigation expanded, uncovering more of Crestview's dealings and forcing the company into bankruptcy. Evelyn's properties were seized to cover legal penalties, her influence in Willow Creek reduced to a cautionary tale. The ranchers, led by Caleb, formed a cooperative to protect their lands, ensuring no HOA could rise again. The Grange Hall meetings continued, now a celebration of victory, a testament to the power of unity and truth. Caleb returned to his ranch that evening, the sky ablaze with a sunset that painted the plains gold. He walked his land, Rusty at his side, the familiar scent of sagebrush grounding him. The surveyor's stakes were gone, the threats silenced, the land his once more. He stood at the edge of his property where his fence met the open plain and felt the presence of his ancestors, their legacy secure. The fight had been long, the cost high, but Caleb had prevailed, not with violence but with the law he'd mastered, the cunning he'd honed, and the fire in his cowboy heart. As he sat on his porch, the stars emerging above, Caleb sipped his coffee, the weight of the battle lifting. Willow Creek was whole again, its soul intact, its people stronger for it. The HOA had come for his land, but they'd underestimated the man who stood in their way. Caleb Warwick, the old cowboy, had known every law in the book, and he'd used them to deliver justice. The land was safe, the legacy enduring, and as the night settled over the plains, Caleb knew he'd fought the last great fight of his life, and won.